We thank you both, and I'd like to call upon someone that's been with me for 15 years from day one, a veteran of our industry, biotechnology, having served Quest Diagnostics, Celera, Cyclone, IXRS, BioMarin. His last job before retirement was to be the global head of commercial and clinical supply for BioMarin. It's my distinct pleasure and privilege to call upon Bill Coakley and his entire panel.
Okay, thank you, Devender, for that gracious introduction. And if the panelists for the IRT could join me. And while they're coming to the to their seats, just a couple brief words to continue on the theme of what Devender had said about this. You don't know what you don't know. I'm assuming most of you know that there's as biopharmaceutical companies get bigger, there's a lot of knowledge that their staff picks up along the way. They over time they have experts in logistics and experts in planning and experts in procurement, and on it goes. But for every Gilead and Roche and Bayer and companies of that know, and for the most part know what they know, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of biotech companies where the staffs are small and they're wearing all the hats of all those functional groups. And they're doing their best to try to figure it out on their own. And how do they learn from their mistakes, or hopefully hearing from the trials and tribulations of the people that they network in? So really that's what this event is all about. It was unfortunate that we weren't able to do the BSMA annual event back in October. And for that matter, we couldn't do one a year ago for the same reason. So we thought, well, while I'm sure we'll have a great event this coming March, there's really a crying for people, what I like to call my peers, to say, we want to get together. We want to see these other people and hear from them. What do they do? What we want to learn from them. And really, that's what the gist of this was. So back earlier this year, we actually did a pretty thorough survey of, what are your biggest challenges? And the list would go too long for me right here and now to say what those challenges were. But we essentially picked two, some of which you'll hear about right now in this panel, the next one about depots. But there will be many more that I'm hoping that you come back in March to hear about, because there's a plethora of challenges all on this theme of you don't know what you don't know. And that's really the basis of what BSMA is all about, learning from each other. And the best way to learn from each other is personal interaction, webinars when we can do them. You're not going to get it out of a textbook. With that said, I would like the panelists for this presentation to each introduce themselves, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Hey everybody. My name's Dan Silva, and I work with a consulting firm called 10th Pen. My firm is small but global, and we focus exclusively in life sciences, and we do both management consulting as well as systems implementations, primarily focused in SAP solutions. And so we're involved in a lot of, lately, a lot of innovative solutions that we position with SAP. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage existing technology with newer technology. to make a real difference in life sciences, because the advancement of some of the capabilities and platforms out there is just amazing. So I think that that's really a bright future. Within 10th Pin, I lead the R&D practice, so I'm heavily focused in clinical supplies as well as cell gene therapy, and we're constantly looking at expanding it even further into clinical operations. Some of the more exciting stuff that's been going on is in the changes that are upcoming with the clinical trials themselves, as well as a concept of clinical on demand, which does encompass some of the direct-to-patient capabilities. I think there's a lot of change upcoming, a lot of flexibility and agility is needed, and I think it's really a great time to be a part of this industry. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening. Ravi Kiran. I'm part of EMB Serona, which is part of Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. So I have to say that in its full entirety because that's the legal way of saying it. We're not part of the US Merck, so just to make myself clear. And I can tell you a history lesson of the difference between the US Merck and us later on over a glass of wine. But I'm responsible for innovation, looking at novel opportunities, looking at novel technologies that can extend our R&D processes, our drug discovery, our drug development, as well as clinical, to see what are the new technologies that we can bring to bear. And these are game-changing technologies. So things I've been looking at in the last 4 years I've been at Merck is things like artificial intelligence and machine learning that applies not only in drug discovery, but also in clinical recruiting and clinical trial design and things like that. We looked at microbiome, we looked at longevity and aging, and I was just telling Devendra earlier that there's a lot of evidence that says whether you have diabetes or not, if you take metformin 500 milligrams a day, you will live 5 years longer. So longevity is a major area of research right now. So that's another interesting arena. So I've been here at Merck KGaA now for 4 years, but my background is I've been at Pfizer, J&J, and a number of biotechs. Started a few companies as well here in the Bay Area. And I would say jack of all, but I'm mainly here on this panel with my esteemed colleagues who are experts on IRT because I did not learn how to say no. Devendra basically called me and said, you have to be on this panel. And I said, yes, sir, that's all. So I will try to give you my perspective of clinical trials, but these are the real experts. So thank you.
Hi, I'm John Paras. I was also persuaded by the vendor to participate on this panel as well. But no, I didn't need to be persuaded. I'm at my prime. We are an IRT in Ecola, system solutions company. I'm kind of a salesman here at the company. I've been in IRT for over 20 years. Started my career actually at what is that, LMAC. Had 2 quarters there. Clinphone, PPD. Actually ran the IRT team at Amgen prior to moving to Prime. So been on both sponsor and vendor side. So kind of happy to be here. IRT is all I know. I actually did this in college. That's actually a true story. I was an intern at LMAC.
Hi, my name is Stacey Anderson. I'm a director in clinical project services with LMAC Clinical Technologies. So we're primarily responsible for the IRT system. So, well, how many of you are familiar with what IRT even is? Okay. So it's interactive response technology. That's what we use to randomize subjects into a clinical trial, what we use for drug assignments and things like that. So I've been with LMAC for 20 years. Maybe even a little more than that now. Kind of worked my way through a lot of different project management, client management, and now I'm a director of our U.S. project management team. So yeah, I hope to share some insight with you on IRT, and feel free to grab me after this if you have any questions or anything, because it comes along a lot later in the process, obviously, so some of you might not be as familiar with it. So what I might say might seem to be a little, I guess, not over your head, but later in the game. So if there's anything I can clarify for you after this, feel free to grab me.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. And there's one other thing I should have mentioned when I was speaking a minute ago. We heard a little about 10th Pen, and they're part of an initiative with Roche and SAP that, among other things, is working with a bunch of what I would call the large, more mature pharmaceutical companies to implement an integrated clinical supply chain solution. And it was interesting, the week I retired, and I didn't mention that earlier, I retired from BioMarin about a year and a half ago. The vendor reached out to me about involvement with BSMA, but I also got a call from 10th Pen, and also from David Vogt from Genentech, and they all had the same vision, which is in order to implement a solution that's really successful in our industry, it all starts with having standardization of business process. And I think today most of you would recognize that if you put 10 companies in the same room and ask them to identify what their systems are, you'll get 11 answers. So while I expect that the initiative that Roche, SAP, and 10th Pen are spearheading is going to be fruitful, what they are asking of us, and I do honestly feel we're up to the challenge, is to help identify and disseminate best practices and help standardize the rest of the industry, because, as I said earlier, for every one of those big companies, there's dozens of smaller companies that are all doing things in their own independent way. And our mission at BSMA, and more specifically the mission of the steering committee that I lead, the Clinical and Commercial Clinical Supply Steering Committee, is to do just that, to identify and disseminate best practices so that if we can get the standards, the processes identified in such a way that we all move in that direction, it'll be that easier, regardless of whether their solution is SAP, Oracle, or whatever the case may be. So I should have mentioned that at the beginning. But anyway, that's what we're all about. So with that said, on to IRT. In the first question, which I'll direct to Dan Silva, is let's start with a simple question for people who are just learning about IRT by asking, what are some ways IRT can help improve forecasting, inventory optimization, or replenishment?
Well, thanks, Bill. It's tremendous for that. Within clinical supplies and clinical trial management, one of the biggest challenges you have is getting accurate data. You're typically the process works by like a phone call on Fridays, and you talk about the barbecue or what's coming up with sports, and then you finally say, okay, how are you doing with my packaging orders or distribution, or what challenges are you having, or did you get the order I sent you earlier in the week? We didn't hear back from you. And that's kind of your way of getting the most up-to-date information. IRT is unique in some ways because it's set up by the drug sponsor, and it immediately has incredible accuracy in terms of patient enrollment, inventory status, dispensation to patients. It's just amazing. And so it comes as typically a cloud-based system that everyone could have access to if they're provided that. And that's the key thing in terms of figuring out what's really going on. Because of course, when you make a plan for a study, you're doing it based on the protocol, and you're doing it based upon, a lot of cases, best case. And then it really happens. And where you're gonna get that data is from IRT. So there's a lot of a lot of efforts to automate much of that integration. And when you can do things like that, then when you plan all of the, I'll call them surprises or the actuals that come in, you're then able to react to it more effectively. And there's a tremendous amount of sophistication too in today's IRT systems. They're going to be fundamental for direct-to-patient because they're covering, I like to think of it as they're covering that last mile, right? Everything else you're doing is getting your inventory and your plans ready to be successful at the site level. So we're seeing a lot of opportunity to integrate that data in, and as soon as it comes in, it can drastically change your plans. And that's really what the clinical supply planner needs to be aware of. But it's really tremendous. I think it's going to have a big part in all of the changes that we're going to see in clinical studies. It's really amazing, and it also sort of insulates some of the people and some of your systems to some of the patient-specific data, and that's also very important. So we see tremendous opportunity with IRT, and there's been an amazing amount of innovation in the different products, all the way down to like cold chain management and different things. It's an amazing area for efficiency as well as accuracy, and I think that the integration of that back into planning is so important. It was a while ago we had done a benchmark across clinical supply companies, and it was the larger pharma. But basically we looked at different capabilities in one category was planning, another one was in sort of like packaging and labeling, a third was distribution, and then the fourth one we just said was sort of the ability to track, because we saw that as a capability across. And the correlation, when you get all that data from like 12 or 13 companies, the correlation was if you're good at planning, you tend to be good at the other ones. You could actually see that data. So it's a little bit like if you're gonna focus on one thing, make sure you're good at planning, because that's obviously gonna pull across to the other functions.
Thank you, Dan. So I know that listening to certain people from study teams, they think that the IRT is a tool for the clinical folks because they need it for drug accountability or for tracking what patient got what drug. And often neglected is the appreciation for what IRT can do for forecasting and figuring out how much drug needs to be at what site. So can you elaborate on how IRT can help in those areas? John.
No, it's a great question, Bill. And I think IRT is just one of those systems that it kind of, we'll say, impacts multiple stakeholders. Typically if you look at, let's say, supply chain like an ERP, that might be your main system. If you're a clinical site, you might mainly be using EDC. Say ClinOps, maybe you're looking at CTMS. For IRT, we straddle supply chain. ClinOps, clinical site, maybe safety, and focus on blind. So it can be used by many different stakeholders, and I think sometimes when you look at sponsor companies, depending on how you're set up, sometimes IRT falls under supply chain, sometimes under ClinOps, sometimes under clinical systems group. That may drive what your priority is, right? And sometimes you have companies that maybe your groups don't talk to each other. Maybe you're a big company like Amgen, and you're just in silos. Maybe you're a small company, you all work together. So I think that this is probably a problem that's existed for so long because it's going to be different based on the company and how you're structured. But to your point about IRT and ClinOps, and we could use it more powerfully for forecasting, definitely agree. I think that it really just, it starts with the sponsor and the different groups and whoever owns IRT, and are they aligned? Are they actually looking, are they talking, saying, okay, well, we need to use IRT for ClinOps for patient tracking, then get an EDC, but have you thought about the forecasting piece? And I think some sponsors view IRT as a commodity. It can be, a lot of money to spend, and maybe sponsors don't want to spend that on a phase 1 trial because they're trying to figure out if that drug is going to be successful. Maybe they want to put their money elsewhere. But I think it's one of those things where instead of doing IRT as a commodity, it's really looking at IRT can be helpful, and if you want to implement that from, let's say, phase 1 for some human, it really can add a lot of value and really be powerful in the overall big picture.
Okay. Thank you, John. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Can I ask
Stacy? Does Stacy have something to add?
I don't know.
Oh, no.
No? Okay, we're good.
Can I ask a question? Can IRT be used for preclinical animal studies?
I don't see why it couldn't be, but we typically haven't dealt with that. Have you, Joan?
Yeah,
It's prohibitive.
I'm sorry?
It's cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless your tox study is.
Like, for example, I'll give you a example. Years ago when I was at Pfizer, we were developing a renin inhibitor. This is for reduction in blood pressure, hypertension. We were doing some late-stage animal studies in cynomolgus monkeys. And these are really expensive animals. And so this was just the penultimate test before you go for an IND, the results of which will actually determine whether this is approvable for an IND or not. And one weekend we had not the usual person who would dose the animals, but it was a stand-in person because that person's wife was sick or something, so somebody else came in. God knows what they did or how they did or something. But the result we got on Monday morning was that one of the animals had died. So that put a whole kibosh on the entire program. Mm-hmm. If we had a system, something like this, that could track, that could see what was going on, even on the preclinical setting, and if there is a way to leverage an IRT process, I mean, that would have saved the program for which we had already spent, by that time, I think $10 million to bring that to that program. And I still remember the next day we had a meeting with the senior VP of clinical, and he says, how do we know that this is not a mistake? But you couldn't do anything about it. So, naive question maybe, but is there a way that we can leverage IRT for things like that beyond just clinical trials?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Ravi. So, in many companies, and it could be because of turnover, whenever there's a new study, oftentimes turnover comes with it. There's a new wave of people that come in with their own personal preferences about what IRT systems to use. And as a result, many companies are faced with too many IRT systems, too many inconsistent processes based on the preferences from the individual study teams. So Stacy, what's the ideal number of IRT solutions a company having multiple studies should have? And how can they standardize across each study team?
So from my experience, I would say that it's best practice to partner with one primary IRT vendor, and you can work with them to really develop standards, talk about the partnerships, set up a governance, but dependent upon your pipeline and how many trials you're actually going to have going at one time, but like with anything, it's always good to have a backup, right? So another vendor that you've onboarded, that you trust, that's familiar with your work and what you're looking to do. But really forming that primary relationship with one vendor, I think is the best way to go, especially if you're a smaller company, because it takes a good amount of work to walk through standards and look at and talk and see what the two companies' shared goals are going to be, right? And then to set up a governance and to determine how you're going to continue to monitor that and stick to standards. All of that takes time and effort. So, really I think sticking with one primary vendor and a backup is the best way to go for that. And I think another key thing to keep in mind there is, and this is what you were talking about a little bit with turnover among staff and people having their preferences, is a lot of people have exactly that preferences, right? And those are not must-haves, those are what we call like want-to-haves. And those aren't necessarily things that are important to the clinical trial, but those are things that can drive up your timelines and the costs of the IRT So I think it's really important for your primary vendor for you to talk with them about what are their capabilities and understanding what capabilities they can offer in their core systems. Because most established IRT vendors, they've established their core systems based off of thousands of trials, and they continue to improve what they can offer in their core, where it's simple to not necessarily customize something, but flip a little button. And you want it this way or you want it that way. You want it this way, you want it that way. And that doesn't add to the cost of the timeline. So we're continually improving our cores. So it's best to really understand what an IRT provider can give you in their core system, because that's what's really going to save you time and money. And then understanding what are those must-haves, and those are the things that are driven by the protocol, right? So different dosing algorithms or things that have to be customized. Those are the things that you can then talk to them about. So, yeah.
Okay.
That's it. But one more thing to add there. So I think because I think you asked about the standards as well and creating that. So you have to kind of look at it in 3 buckets. So what does the IRT provider have as their core? Is it kind of going to fit your needs for the most part? But then this is where we kind of run into trouble sometimes, to be honest. It's like, what is the sponsor willing to standardize? So that's where we run into problems with staff turnover. One person agreed, okay, we'll standardize these types of settings, or who has access to these reports, or these are the standard reports we want, and then someone else comes in and changes it. So making sure that you've really thought through what you are willing to standardize and what the IRT vendor has to do to, meet your SOPs and things like that. So really, if you partner with the vendor, you can work through all of those things and come up with a way that you can, for the most part, have your systems that are almost entirely built easily from your standards, and you can only just focus on those really protocol-specific things. And that's what really saves you time and money. Another thing to remember is the IRT vendor, they are experts in IRT. Most of the people we work with, lots of times you might have worked on 1 study, 2 studies, but have a lot of ideas, but we've actually gone through them through thousands of trials. So I think it is important to not just look at an IRT like a vendor, but to look at them like a true partnership and really listen to what they have to say, because they should be there to consult you and to provide you best practices.
Thank you, Stacy. As a company that has helped support hundreds of clients and probably thousands of studies, I'm wondering, how common is it for you to experience clients that have inaccurate inventory information because they're unable to adequately manage the amount of inventory that should be reported out of an IRT?
For me as well.
Yeah.
So inaccurate inventory at sites can be a common occurrence, but I think if you partner appropriately with the IRT vendor, you can really eliminate a lot of the things that cause that in the long run. So just really, thinking through the way the IRT is designed to have validation checks and things like that all in place so that you have the correct inventory at your sites. But people get involved, right? So the main reason we find that there is a lack of, or insufficient supplies at a site or something, is that someone wasn't properly using the IRT. So if you do the drug assignments through the IRT, you acknowledge drug on time, you damage out kit statuses and things like that as it happens, you're going to have correct inventory. But if people aren't doing that, you're going to have incorrect inventory. And when we mostly see that is in unnumbered trials, so the drug is unlabeled, you don't need to get assigned a kit number, right? So at the site, patient comes in, clinician grabs it off the shelf, doesn't call the IRT like they were supposed to. So now the IRT thinks this drug is still on the shelf. It's there to give to the next patient that comes in. So the next patient comes in and that drug isn't there for them. So by really educating the sites and making sure that they're using the IRT as they're supposed to do, you can really mitigate a lot of those problems. One other thing the IRT does handle, and that it's very good to train the sites and make sure they're doing as well, is when things get damaged at a site after, right? So you've already acknowledged your shipment, but someone drops 4 vials, a freezer goes out. So right away you want to contact the IRT vendor because they're the ones who are going to send you that resupply shipment. So, you know, things like that are really important. Another small but important one is making sure that when the shipments come in, that the sites are actually acknowledging the shipment right away. Because when they don't do that, they don't acknowledge it in the IRT system thinks that the drug isn't actually at the site, right? So then a patient comes in, they call, that's how long they don't call anymore. They log into the web and try to get a drug assignment for the patient, and the IRT will tell them there's no drug available. Well, there's a drug on the site, right here on the shelf, you're looking at it. So then you have to call the IRT help desk, they'll tell you to acknowledge the shipment. You know, it's a simple solution, right? Just do it later. But the whole time while you've done that, the patient is sitting there. And so you want to limit like any negative experiences for the patient. So again, just compliance with the IRT. The IRT is set up to make the process smooth. So as long as you follow what you're supposed to do with the IRT, I think you can eliminate a lot of those challenges.
Okay. Yeah, John.
Just to add, I agree with everything that Stacey just said. I think one thing when you look at like, why is there always a disconnect, I think this also is another thing where for those in supply chain, sponsor side, make sure that you partner with your FinOps teams and understand what the processes are, because I think that IRT is a tool to actually do the things, but you got to be aligned on the process. So I think that it's going to be different per company, but just ensure you have alignment between your clinical ops, like site training process and your supply chain.
That's a good point. And it's actually a good lead for the next question that, John, I'm going to direct to you. I've had several conversations at previous steering committee meetings about drug accountability and reconciliation. And my limited experience in that area suggested that there's 2 different groups of people that are essentially trying to do this. We got the clinical supply chain group that's responsible for the drug accountability of what ships from the distributor to the patient site. And then you've got a different group, often the study team lead or the CRO or the site monitor or whatever, that's responsible for the drug, doing the drug accountability at the patient's site. What's been dispensed to the patient, what's been destroyed, what's been returned. But, so when I've asked the question, okay, how do you make sure that all the drug that's been added from the first group in the second group, when you put it together, it all adds up? And every time I've asked that question, I've gotten the same answer, which was, Bill, I'm hoping by the time that's figured out, I'm no longer working at this company. What should the answer be?
Well, I think I mentioned before, IRT straddles many different groups. So I think when you look at systems, IRT could be the one that could really track everything. Obviously, you want to designate different access per role. So, for example, you said supply chain, maybe they're overseeing the distribution of drug from the site, so maybe they oversee that piece. And then you have your CRAs, your monitors, in your clinical sites, they can track the accountability, right? But it's also going to tie back to that alignment on process, right? As a big company, and there was no alignment. They had a lot of process, but they didn't really talk to each other, right? So I think that's really the opportunity. It's that conversation, that communication between the 2 groups. Oftentimes on sponsor companies, you're going to have clinical supply, or supply chain could be clinical commercial on one side, and you have your R&D. You got to get that bridge in between.
Yeah, and if I can just add something there, personal experience here, we're doing a clinical study in Korea. So the drug substance is manufactured in Switzerland. So it needs to be packaged and everything and labeled and they don't want certain labels, but some things need to be labeled and others not. Communication is the biggest drawback there, and what is lost in translation, because what people in Switzerland are saying is not understood by the people in Korea, or they misrepresent what was being said, and that creates such a major issue. So how much drug do you have? How much drug do you not have? What is the stability? What is availability? Things like that. So we've had lots of issues with just language and communication as well. So.
Thank you. Okay, I've got a question about integration. You know, I've heard and sometimes have seen that IRT systems are integrated with distributors, with couriers, with their own internal system like SAP or Oracle, whatever, and then other systems, EDC, Smart Supplies, or whatever. I don't know if that's the standard or that's primarily a pipe dream that only the biggest, more mature companies have. So Dan, what have you seen, knowing that you've had exposure to many companies and what they integrate or have decided not to integrate?
Well, sure. So at the larger pharma level, where they have more than 100 studies, there's a big focus on efficiency, you can imagine, right? In terms of, you know, making sure the data comes in and that there's some consistency to what the processes are. So there's where you're going to see the investments in integration. But then when you get maybe to the mid-size or lower levels, maybe the studies are smaller or not quite as many. I still consider it integration. It's just manual integration in terms of being able to look at the data and decide what's needed in the other system. So I think that maybe one of the biggest things is making sure you get the updated enrollment information, because you're going to plan at some level where you're smoothing it out, and then you're going to wait and see what truly happens, and that's where things can really change on you. But I think you could go crazy with a lot of the integration. I think if you're getting a regular feed, and what you typically see is a strategy of pulling it into something called a data hub, where you're pulling it one place and then distributing it out to where it needs to go. And then you start getting your maybe single source of truth as well, in terms of where you would look to get your reports, as well as what's going to be like that central tool that's going to be populating your other systems. It's a big deal. I think that's really where, the IRT does an awful lot, and we just heard some great examples of a wonderful tool, but if the operations aren't tight, you're going to have, then the data's wrong. But there's a lot of talk about, we had a conversation the other day about, data intelligence. And you can have data without intelligence, but you can't really have intelligence without the data being accurate. So all the best tools in the world, it's kind of like one step further than what we were just talking about with IRT, would be the challenge. So I think, it's technology, but it's also the operations on how you have to plan to do that, and some of the other things that Stacy was saying about, aligning towards a primary IRT vendor. I think that's very important. I've seen companies that have like 5 or 6 IRT tools. Typically that means ClinOps is making those choices, right? And they're picking which ones are better for which therapeutic areas, which types of studies. Just makes it a little bit harder on the supply chain professionals to be putting some standards in place. So I think there's always a technical side, and then there's the operational side. And one of the companies I could probably talk about it in one-on-one, but the person that, if they're not that big, but the person that heads up clinical supplies, one of his strategies was to remove unnecessary complexity, right? Let's not have multiple IRTs if it's not getting us somewhere. So he actually had the IRT function roll in under clinical supplies. And I thought he did a great job, because that's where they would be setting everything up. That's where they can adopt the standards. That's where you've got a vision across all of the studies. Interestingly enough, that didn't last. I don't know. I want to find out the rest of the story. but it got pulled back into clinical operations. So it's, and I imagine this would be part of the input we could get from Stacy and John is, you know, where's the biggest value of IRT? You know, is it really in the clinical ops side? Is it really on the clinical supply side? I imagine it's probably close to 50-50, but I'd be interested in what that opinion is or what you've seen in companies as well.
You know, honestly, I think it is 50-50, and I think that's the importance of partnering with an IRT vendor, because they can talk to you about making sure you're including all of the people in the organization that the IRT is going to impact, because that is something we see a lot. You know, ClinOps, they're not thinking about drug management really. It's like, that's an afterthought when you're working through the drug shipment details. It's like, oh, okay, now you can bring them in. We've already developed the IRT system, and now it's just about the settings. But really, the sooner you can pull an IRT vendor in, the better it's going to be, because you can really understand what they can provide for you and how they can best serve all areas of the organization. So, do you have anything to add to that, John?
Yeah, are there any ClinOps folks in the room? Yeah, any ClinOps folks?
ClinOps.
100% supply chain. That's the most important thing, guys. So really, you're right. It really depends. You know, from a supply chain perspective, I mean, what are your priorities? You want to make sure that you have end-to-end visibility of the product. You want to make sure that you're not producing too much. You want to have as little wastage as possible, right? For ClinOps, you're thinking, I want to make sure every patient has drug every time, right? And you've got to find that balance. And where is that balance?
Yeah.
Right?
Good point. Devendra and I were actually talking about something similar to this earlier, that to the point, there are no ClinOps people in the audience. It's very supply chain centric. And you've heard many comments here where these two groups are working in silos and one doesn't understand the needs of the other. I can't tell you how many times I've heard clinical supply group moan because an IRT system wasn't put in the budget for a study. Why? Because they deemed the study too small, not enough patients, and that was the deciding factor. There wasn't a discussion about all the other reasons why perhaps it would justify whatever that expense would be. So we're tasked with making sure that where we go, we want to include not just the supply chain folks, but the clinical folks, because there are times when we have common needs, there are times when they're very different, but we need to understand what each other's needs are. So enough said on that. So I think I've run out of time to ask any additional questions from this, but if there are one or two questions from the audience that you would like to direct to anybody here, feel free to do so.
I'll throw one out there. So we saw a big, and you mentioned IVRS, which dates you, but we've seen some technological improvements from IVRS, where people picked up the phone, for those of you guys, back when the phone was connected to the wall, and they called in and got the treatment for a particular patient. And then it's gone through IWRS, and then finally we got modular systems, right? And now it's plug and play, right? Like she said, you press a button and you get what you want out of this platform. My question to the panel is, where do you think this is going? And I think he mentioned rolling it up into SAP, and I think there's a huge opportunity here to look for ways to roll this up, so we can look at the program level versus the study level. For companies that have multiple studies and multiple IRTs, like when you bundle all this up, that's great for supply chain. We can press one button and see where all our product is. But I want to hear from the panel, like, where do you guys think this is going from a technological standpoint? Also keeping in mind that when we did roll out modular IRT, the price point dropped dramatically. And now we could offer IRT to phase 1s and phase 2s, where prior to this it was cost prohibitive, largely because it was like $500 grand to build a system, and it took 6 months. And now it's what, 100 and something, and it takes 2 weeks after contract. Now it takes how long did it take you and all that? Like a month?
Yeah, it depends on the complexity.
Right. So,
Yeah.
that's what I want to hear from the panel.
Okay.
I have something to say, so.
I mean, I think you're hitting on a lot of the trends that are going on now. Companies are starting to look at IRT and say, what's our IRT strategy, which I think is pretty cool. And it goes into things like, well, for complicated studies, we want to start using this, and for the ones that are less complicated, we're more interested in simplicity and speed and configurability and things like that. One of the things that's always interested me is that IRT, by its nature, has to optimize per study. And then, of course, if you've got a single compound that's going across studies, well, how do you optimize with that, right? And it gets into, delaying packaging and labeling, and some of the more direct-to-patient stuff. So I think, for me, it would be, gathering the data and intelligence across multiple studies and starting to provide like an analytics or some kind of an automation capability. I think there's some really good benefit there, and I think it has to come with greater capability for smaller lot sizes and smaller deliveries, because the cost of the drugs is going way up too, and expiry date management, all that stuff kind of pulled together. If you have accurate data and you can go across the different studies, which is a little bit of what I was alluding to before, then your decision making can be optimizing across those. Interestingly enough, there is some pushback on some of that stuff, because if you were responsible for an individual study at the clin ops level, I'm not so sure you're real excited about supply chain optimizations. You're going to be concerned about the performance of the delivery of your study. So optimization it can go up one level, where you're looking across maybe the compound or maybe even the therapeutic area, but there's always another level too, which is sort of at the R&D level, in terms of where the dollars are being spent and what risks you want to take. So I think there's a ways to go. I think now we're at the stage now where all this data can be pulled in, and you can be doing some analytics to it, optimizing some stuff. Probably got a little ways to go there, but I think that might be what's next.
So you answered my question, essentially, that you can bring it down at a price point that you can use it in preclinical animal studies. That would be huge. That would be phenomenal.
One of the challenges from the outside looking in I've seen here is that if you look at the commercial arena, there's a fair amount of maturity there with respect to their processes and their technology. And they have a pretty good grasp about end-to-end, what the end-to-end supply chain is, the processes behind it, and how to integrate that from a technology perspective. On the clinical side, again, with the exception of the bigger companies, everybody is planning with manual systems, Excel, perhaps 70% of studies have IRT, but most of them are not integrated. And in that space, I don't think there's as good a grasp of the end-to-end supply chain to understand how what the inputs and outputs are in order to use the data, the information, if you will, to make informed decisions. And I think that's the future lies in how do we solve that problem. And we're trying to do it with some of our sub-teams within the steering committee. And actually, our steering committee is called Clinical and Commercial Steering Committee because by design, we're saying there's things that we can learn from the commercial side so that the clinical side doesn't have to reinvent the wheel.
There's things in clinical that commercial don't have to do.
Yeah.
It's a whole other ballgame when you do clinical. The
Yeah.
regulatory piece is huge. Per study, huge. Same product, multiple studies, different countries, different requirements.
Yeah.
And you're changing formulation. And you're
Yeah, but now what we're seeing, especially with the orphan drugs and gene therapy, where, you know, the first thing you do is try to get a commercial product approved, and then you add the infant study or the adolescent study or the, you know, the one-eyed study, you know, that you're now sharing the same drug substance and drug product across clinical and commercial, and you need an integrated system to make sure that you've managed that. And I think just through the nature of that, it's going to force the integration of clinical and commercial into one solution.
Yeah, but what's the primary solution for commercial? SAP, right?
Yes.
And what's the primary tool for clinical? IRT. And Excel.
True, but you're seeing initiatives such as the 10th pin SAP Roche one that has 15, 20 mature pharmaceutical companies all working together, where they're reaching out to BSMA and say, we want the rest of the small and mid-size to tag along, help us get at least the processes to standardize so that they can jump on the bandwagon as well.
Right, so show me a system like IRT that you can get for $150K and you can start up in 28 days that will do that, and I guarantee you all of the small and mid-sized companies will jump on board. But nobody's going to invest in the time and energy it takes to build an SAP system.
But if you think about it, let's pretend a small, medium-sized biotech company has 20 studies, and I don't think that's an unreasonable number to pick. If 70% of those 20 studies are spending $150,000 to $200,000 per study for their IRT system, without knowing it, they're investing in a solution that is short-sighted.
Commercial doesn't have a patient portion of the IRT and EDC that you have to have. Commercial just sells things. You already know your patient.
Mm-hmm.
For clinical, it has multiple different reasons you have to have them.
If you look at certain companies in the room, BioMarin and Beijing as two perfect examples, supply chain, clinical and commercial supply chain are all in the same, manage both, so that the infrastructure is there to make it happen.
So is Exenesis.
But do they manage it?
Yeah, that's right. So that may be part of the solution, is instead of there being separate infrastructures, which many of the larger pharmaceutical companies do, which maybe is the reason why we haven't got out of this quandary yet, that they need to recognize and integrate their own infrastructure to get their arms around the problem.
But that's where I think, instead of looking at an SAP system that takes a lot to invest in, right, and a long time, if you can modularize that SAP commercial system, so you have a clinical kind of startup system for an entry price point that can grow into a commercial system in the future, that's what is needed.
And that's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, that's what's being done, for example, with the SAP initiative. Their commercial clients are using it for commercial, and now they're saying, how do we enhance it to be able to use it as a tool for clinical?
That's true. There's a few, yeah, it's just a few aspects that you would want. I mean, complex aspects that you put from a commercial system into clinical. And previously, for 5 large pharmas, that was extremely expensive, right? To make those kinds of, that level of customizations. One of the biggest, of course, is just being able to define a study in SAP. It basically took a whole new module. There's no other place in SAP to put stuff like that, right? That this is the study, the protocol number, the countries, the numbers of patients, first patient in, last patient out, all those parameters, right? As well as blinding. So that was really a complexity. And the effort now that Roche and 10th Pin and SAP are under is to do a lot of those things, but do it as part of the standard product. So the investment's all up front. And I do think one thing that's different now too is that the pricing will be volume-based. So the world's changing a bit on some of that stuff, and there's cloud components. But it's the intent of the consortium that was set up was that it would be an industry solution, and that at least extends into mid-market. So maybe there's a good future there.
Dan, are you saying, is it Mike?
Jed.
Okay.
Are you saying to him that there could be a modular solution for that problem that you described, rather than having forced to be embracing SAP?
That's a possibility. I mean, obviously it starts off maybe not so modular, but then once the capability is there and it starts maturing, then I could see that being a next step.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You know, I think so much development now is cloud-based. Companies don't want a new on-premise software. I mean, they want to buy it as sort of a service, and they want to pay for it by its volume. So I think it just opens up some new models that, you know, may be a few years off, but I think it's entirely possible.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to IRT, one of the things that made the modular approach so useful was that, you know, the systems that are designed today have the ability to go in and plug and play for just about any size client, independent of what their existing systems are. And that's what makes it remarkable compared to what it used to be, right? Where it was all customized software. You spend 3 months trying to decide what you're going to do, and then another 3 months writing it, and then you have to test it, and blah, blah, blah. You know, and that's very much where SAP still is today. It's so complicated, so complex, that it's really a huge project to build an SAP system.
Well, no, yeah, and we're hitting a wall with people don't want to customize it either, because that kind of, it makes things more expensive down the road. So this whole idea of, you know, having some of SAP be, you know, continuing to be like on-premise software that you don't touch, and then on top of it having maybe some cloud components, because it also adds a lot of agility, right? Because as soon as you build something, things change, right? There's all kinds of new study designs, or, you know, some new requirements come out, and then you're just always playing catch up, and whatever you've changed before now becomes more brittle or more complex to change. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons. I think what you're saying is accurate. It's a matter of how does the architecture and the capability change for the future. And I think there's some really, really good possibilities.
And it's not limited to this subject.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it with all the quality.
So can I ask, just in the interest of time, that we continue that conversation during the break? So first, I'd like to thank the panelists for their insightful information, and suggest a 20-minute break. Hope people grab a drink, go around to the tables to meet vendors. And we'll reconvene for the second panel in 20 minutes. Thank you.